To slightly echo some of the wonderful comments that Dr. made just before me, I'd like to have you look at this young man here and imagine that you saw him walking down Fifth Avenue. Would you think he was homeless? Of course you would not, but yet this young man was kicked out of his house for not stopping being gay. So his parents threw him out. And now he's living in a series of shelters. And for different reasons, the same thing is true for each one of these young people. They're 18, 19, 24 years old, and they're homeless. But they don't want that fact to be obvious. They want to be invisible. They want to look like other kids do. On any given night in our area, about 240 young people are homeless, and they're hidden to us, primarily, mostly. They're living in shelters, but most of them are actually living along railroad tracks, in our parks, sleeping in abandoned buildings and under bridges. And there are terrible dangers to them, as Dr. highlighted. We also know, in addition to the things that he mentioned, that 28% of them will be robbed, 34% will be physically assaulted, and a good share of them, unfortunately, will trade sex for food and shelter. The safety of these young people is the primary reason that the Department of Human Services in Allegheny County asked me to take a look at the issue here in Allegheny County. They had other concerns as well. The next one I want to mention is exactly what Dr. Centrone was talking about, which is that these are adults technically, but we all know that they are transitioning into adulthood. And now I've learned more about the developmental levels that they actually may be at that extend far beyond the age of 24. Many enter homelessness after very difficult childhoods. And they were also concerned because young adults approach our system that we've built largely for adults in a very different way. I mentioned that they would like to hide, but it's also that they don't have a clue about the services that we all know so very well exist. Here's an example of a contrast between what young adults do when they find themselves homeless and what those of us who are over a certain age would do. They're much more likely to sleep in indoor areas not normally used for sleeping, such as abandoned buildings. They are more likely to pool their money, if they can, and sleep in a motel or a hotel. That's usually just for a very short period of time, of course. And they are less likely to sleep in the emergency shelters that we have set up for adults. This last point may be true here in our area and in other parts of the country because there is an undersupply of emergency shelters, especially for this age group. So that, as in New York and DC, on cold winter nights, as in January 2012, there is an undercapacity, and here our capacity was 8% above what we could handle. So kids were turned away. Now, for young people who are LGBT, there's an added layer of concern about staying in shelters. They are fearful that they'll be treated without equality when they go to those shelters. Some of them have actually had that experience here in Pittsburgh. They've been taunted and physically hurt by other people who are in those shelters. They just do not feel safe. So this constellation of issues means that there are more kids who become homeless and then will stay stuck there for longer periods of time, and we'll have lost our chance to intervene with them. In response to those concerns, Department of Human Services asked me to answer these three questions. What are the dimensions of the problem here? What can we learn from approaches that other cities are using? Are there gaps here, and what are the areas for improvement? Now, I placed the word we in there intentionally because, as I came to realize, which all of you know, our housing and homelessness system is certainly not controlled by any one entity. The money doesn't come from any one entity. Here's a chart that shows you just a sample of basically this is the backbone of homelessness assistance funding that flows here into Allegheny County, the city of Pittsburgh, Penn Hills, McKeesport. There's not one place that you go to say, well, they're in charge of the entire system. That, of course, is the strength of our system here, too, is that we have incredible collaboration. But it also means that when there's time to make some changes, it's a community-wide effort that's really required. So just a quick note on methods. Of course, you start out by really trying to get your understanding through what other people have written, what the research says. But then I went to talk to a lot of you, practitioners who work every day with young adults and other adults. And had interviews that were incredibly enriching with young people, which were arranged through GLCC on Grant Street. And I had the chance to collect some, or to use some of the data that DHS collects through the HMIS system and their data warehouse. And they helped with doing some analysis. And with the help of all of those individuals, I was able to prepare a report that describes the system, how our young adults are using it, and what we might do to improve it. So I'll spend a few minutes on each of the topics that are covered in this report, and right after that, Chuck Keenan, who's with the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, will come up and talk with us about some of the concrete things that a group of you have been working on. So first, some notes about the youth. As you all know, and has just been said, we have to be terribly cautious about generalizing about any group of people, especially young people. Someone wrote that this is a group of people who are heterogeneous and in flux, and that is so true. But it is true that you can look at their characteristics and compare them with their peers who do have an apartment to go to at night or a house to go to, and you'll see some differences. They're more likely to have been abused, as you well know, and have been in foster care at some point in their life. And while living on the streets, they have engaged in additional criminal justice involvement, but some of them have juvenile records to start with. A small fact, but something that actually matters later on, is that about 60% of them are fined for quality of life offenses for sleeping at park benches in Market Square. LGBTQ youth are way overrepresented in the homeless youth population. They're 5% of their age band nationally. They're 40 or 30% around here of our young adult homeless population. Another important fact to point out is that their rate of high school diplomas or degrees is half that of their kids in their age band who do have a place to stay at night. And there are several reasons, many reasons for youth homelessness, many of which Dr. Cintron talked about. But one of the things I wanted to mention is work. From the perspective of young people, having a job means that they could pitch in with other kids and get an apartment. So when I asked the youth that I spoke with, and it was about 25 youth altogether over a period of 4 focus groups, when I asked them, what do you need? Can somebody please help me find a job? It wasn't give me a place to stay tonight because they think they figured that out all right. It's how can I get out of this by getting a job? And yet, I think when we really imagine the services that we want to deliver to young people, employment, training, education may not be the first ones that pop into our lives. It may not be the first above housing, but it certainly should be on the top of our list. Of course, youth in this age group are evicted from their families, by their families, but in some cases there's no difference between being evicted and leaving because people don't want them there, so they feel the need to have to leave. Parents also can trigger homelessness as a retribution. So kids I met who were at the Art Institute, one young man had been there, his parents found out that he was gay and said, that's it with your tuition. And then he had to stay in one person's dorm room one night and another felt unwelcome, and then he was on the street and wondered where he should go. You know, it's interesting though that even though youth don't feel welcome, or there are arguments or parents are really angry that they're drinking or blowing their curfew, 1 in 5 young people do try to go back home. So to the point about reunification that I'll make a little bit later on, that was an interesting thing to note, that there's a desire on the parents' side and family side at some points, and also on youth, when it's safe to do. It's a very good idea to embark on that. And the behavioral health issues Dr. Cintron mentioned are very strong in this age group, and of course worsen. And a number of young people told me, I didn't think I had depression before, but I think I do now. And that's obviously something that would happen to almost anybody who had to endure what they do. Actually, sorry, one more thing. So I'm going to show you a little 2-minute clip of a video that was done by Invisible People, which you can find online. It's an excellent nonprofit organization that interviews homeless youth adults across the country. When they came to Pittsburgh last fall, they interviewed this young man whose name is Breon. And I'd like you to listen to these couple of minutes because it gives you an indication about what he's been through. You can see his earnestness, and you can also see that he does have some hope for his future. He does answer the question about 3 wishes. He says, that's unrealistic. I can't wish for anything. And then he thinks a little bit more, and then he said, I would wish to change my whole childhood. And I hesitate to tell you this, but I think you need to know that this young man is now in state prison. What happened to him was that later on, that probably within a couple of months of this video being made, he was at Station Square at night, and a group of guys came out of a bar, and they started teasing him for what he was wearing. He had a puffy backpack on and whatever they didn't like about his clothes. And they started to chase him around, and he had a knife in his backpack, and he stabbed one of the guys, and the young man whom he stabbed recovered but was critically injured. And he ended up going to state prison for the felony aggravated assault. So it makes you want to cry when you realize the distance between where he was at that point in his dreams and where he stands now. Doesn't mean his future is completely blown, but it does make you understand what an impact is on a guy like this to have nobody to turn to, nobody to go home to, no caring adult in his life. Fortunately, most of the kids, here's the typology again, most of the kids will end up being okay and going home. Sure, thanks, Sam. Most of the young people we're talking about are low risk and transient. It's really the transient connected, people who cycle in and out of homelessness that we really have to be very, very cautious about, very careful about, and chronically homeless, people who have long periods of time where they are homeless. And we really do need to intervene so that we make all these numbers 0. So let me turn for a bit to the local picture. First, let me talk about this number 240, which I know everybody thinks sounds very low, but it really is a point-in-time count. So the way we came to this number is that we started with the actual enumeration that took place in January 2012. And as you know, all across the country, cities and counties go out and count people who are in shelters or in transitional housing or who are unsheltered. And then you come back, you have volunteers and staff who do this work. You come back and you put that all on paper, and then you come to a certain number. Some parts of the country invest a lot more effort in doing that. They have tons of volunteers so that when you go out, you have a square mile to look at instead of many square miles to look at. And you're much more likely to have the time and ability to find kids wherever they are, especially when they don't want to be found. It's very difficult to do that. So what we did was took the number that were actually counted in shelters, left that number the same. It was 91. And by the way, this is the 18 to 24-year-old age group who are individuals, not families. And then we looked at the number that was counted at that time, and we realized that that number for unsheltered was pretty low. And so what we did is we looked at what Portland, Oregon had done, because they have a very good youth counts effort. And the ratio of sheltered to unsheltered is for every one young person in a shelter, there was 1.6 who were unsheltered. And we just applied that ratio to here in Allegheny County, assuming it's a similar population. And that brings up our unsheltered number to 146. So that 237 rounded up is how we got to the 240. A couple things to mention here is that this does not include couch surfers because the point-in-time count doesn't go looking for people staying with strangers or staying with friends in their homes. If we did that, research shows that it would double to quintuple your count, your point-in-time count. Individuals included here are not, if somebody were a 20-year-old and had a baby, they would not turn up in discounted individuals. They would be counted, but as a family. So I just want you to understand that particular figure. Okay, so what does our system look like? Well, the report that you have in your packet maps out in detail each sort of slice of the system. And the reason we decided to do this that way was because we thought to ourselves, how is it that a young person who's living on the street finds out about what the services are? Where do they go to stay warm during the day if they don't have a shelter? Where are the shelters they might go to? Where could they get food? Where would they go if they want to make a phone call? What about brushing their teeth or taking a shower? What are our resources from those different aspects? And to what extent are some of these consolidated or spread apart? So we wanted to have a sense of that. And I think that we came to that because when we talked to the young people, it became pretty clear that they really didn't know where to go for the most part. The way they did learn is from one another, as you would expect. Word of mouth was the primary way that they found out what was where. Just imagine, for example, that young person I mentioned from the Art Institute of Pittsburgh who is now homeless. Imagine he walks down the street from the Art Institute. He's in downtown Pittsburgh. He doesn't know about GLCC. No outreach worker has encountered him yet because our outreach grants have dried up around here. We used to have GLCC had a grant, or Persad had one. Three Rivers Youth used to have a large one. I think Family Links used to have one. These federal grants have gone away. So our outreach function is really based completely upon Operation Safety Net, Community Human Services, Operation Save a Life, volunteers, and whatever the shelters can do with their volunteers, and faith-based organizations can do with theirs as well. So that's our outreach. It's unlikely that this young man would have encountered a peer on the street saying, hey, you want to come talk a little bit about some of the resources here. Obviously, I've not done this work. So that's the first step, is that we have a very thin outreach component in Allegheny County. So now let's say he comes down the street and he sees the food line, which is across from the Post-Gazette underneath the Boulevard of the Allies, that walkway that covers it. Underneath there, every night, 7 days a week, volunteers come and they pass out food. And that is primarily where young people go to get food if they are not staying in a shelter. And that's also where this young man would find out where to go for services. It's exactly what I heard from almost everybody. We go to the food line. Of course, there are many other resources that they could go to, and here's an example of what's in the report. There are charts like this about each aspect that I'm going to be talking about. But here are the places that they told me and that you told me as providers, and that I called and made sure and verified these hours, but these are the places that they could go for food if they were not staying in a shelter. So this is the 146 people who were unsheltered, let's say. So let's say now he's gotten some food. If it were Monday night, he would also be able to get clothing and shoes from Miss Nancy, who also sets up there in that same location. And Miss Nancy and her volunteers come there with clean clothes, and will even take in a young person's clothing and wash it for them. Or if someone says, I have a job interview next week, can you come with something? She will do that for them. They know that. If they're in shelter, or if they know to go to a shelter, there's clothing, there are shoes, there's all kinds of resources there. But for people who are living on the street, it's much more difficult to find these resources. One thing that when I asked them, what would you dream of? What would really help you the most? What would help other kids? They said, could there be a place where you could come like any time of the day, and there would be people there to help you, and all you service providers, you could come there and tell us what you could do to help us, and then you could help us find jobs, and maybe we could do our laundry. And maybe this is too much to ask, but maybe we'd be allowed to sleep there if we have like a job at night. Basically, they were describing a comprehensive drop-in center, which is what we used to have when the hub existed in the Strip District, and which so many of you are working to put together in different ways, but really doesn't exist in a comprehensive way in Allegheny County right now. And that is why one of the recommendations is that we work together to build such a drop-in center, because we all know that we need something like that. Just referencing food for a second, here are a couple of pictures. The person on your left is handing out bag lunches at the Red Door, downtown Pittsburgh. And I don't want to forget to make the point that our shelters provide meals, 1, 2, or 3 meals a day. Now, let me talk about shelters for a minute. very important to stress that for this age group of 18 to 21, we have a comprehensive shelter called the Downtown Outreach Community Shelter that is an uptown. It's run by Family Links, and it provides all of the services I think you'd really want for these young people. The problem is that the age range stops at 21, and we also don't have every service that that these youth could use within that one location. Here are a couple of pictures. One's Pleasant Valley and the other is Light of Life Mission, just to give you a sense of our local adult shelter capacity. A picture of what it's like to sleep there. Something else I think I need to mention about the adult shelters and some of the other services that we provide here. As I would call around and talk with providers, and I would say, I'm just calling to confirm that these are the hours you're open. Tell me about this, again, the services that you provide. If a 20-year-old were, I wouldn't send a 20-year-old here. Even though they're adults, in some settings, they're either not used to, don't welcome, or have learned it's not the wisest thing for either older or younger people to have them mixed together. So that's something really to pay attention to. So on paper, it may look like, oh my goodness, we have all these resources. But not every place really is welcoming these young people or thinks that's the appropriate place for the young people to go. This is a picture of a young man who was interviewed by the Post-Gazette, and he was in the transitional housing program at Family Links. And that's a program for 16 to 21-year-olds, also in Uptown. That's the next step after emergency housing. You get to go to transitional housing, and then you can get all kinds of services and support, medical care within that particular facility. We also have scattered around places where young people can get showers, brush their teeth, do their laundry, talk on the telephone, check their internet. These are in different locations, but as I think I'm making a point many times over here is that there really isn't one place where all of this is available to youth, and nor do they know about it. When I ask them where they go if they are not staying in the shelter, where do they go to stay warm and or get cool in the summertime, they go to our libraries. They know the hours of libraries. They know that the one in Oakland is the one that's open on Sundays. And the libraries are not only because of that they're more comfortable, but that's also where they can get internet access and check Facebook and their email. And the picture on the right is one of the rooms at the Gay Lesbian Community Center, which is right on Grant Street downtown near the Boulevard des Allies. It's down below. And that has become a refuge for a lot of young people, whatever their sexual orientation, gender identity is. This particular place welcomes them. It's open till 9 o'clock at night, it's open from 12 to 9. And there's a period of time for 3 or 4 hours of most days when Homeless Children's Education Fund and a lot of you work together on the SAY project, and they serve meals and have activities and do sort of soft counseling and also bring in medical care. So in your way, you really tried to work to put together a drop-in center. I won't speak so much for Lindsay, but I'll try. Lindsay is the person who helped arrange all the interviews with young people and who runs the center. There isn't room for a shower or washer or dryer. And this is basically the space with a little kitchen in the back of this area. And there's Miss Nancy. And then on the right is just sort of a reminder to myself to say that, shelters provide clothes and shoes and sundries. Three Rivers Youth, which is out in East Liberty, does that for young people as well. And it has a drop-in center that's open with limited hours, again, funding issues for them. And this is I think the way to sort of piece it together in my mind was to look at this map, which was drawn by a guy whose name is John, and he's 23 years old. And he told me that he draws maps for other young people when he runs into them. Other homeless kids. And I said, well, would you draw me a map? And he said, yeah, this is, and if you could see it up in the left corner, it says not to scale, just so you know. And what it shows, and that's my pencil coloration, but you see the rivers, and then you'll see the south side where it says sort of number 1. And I thought to myself, what would it take if John went to the library on a Thursday, got an email and it said, you have a job interview on Monday. Okay, how do you get ready? And this guy is living on the streets. I should mention, in reality, he lives along the train tracks below Mount Washington. He has a sleeping bag down there, and that's where he's been staying. Okay, so what he'd have to do is time it and know about this. Have to know that he has to go to Pleasant Valley to wash his clothes on Friday. That's open from 9 to 12. Or he can go to Shepherd's Heart between 8 and 10, which is in Uptown. Shepherd's Heart is, I think I marked it like number 2 on there. And then on Saturday and Sunday, he can get his meals. He can get 3 meals a day by going to Light of Life on the north side, or he can go to the Food Line, which I mentioned is downtown, or at Shepherd's Heart, which is uptown. And then on Monday, knowing that he doesn't have a bus, or excuse me, he doesn't have a bus pass, he can get a van ride if he goes to Shepherd's Heart at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's where he can get breakfast, get a shower, and then he can catch their 8:25 van, or if the interview timing works, he can get their 10:55 van and then hope that the van will take him near where he needs to go. Look at what it takes for somebody who's not in a shelter, an awful lot of the kids, to be able to negotiate through their lives when they don't know where this stuff is, and you get kids walking around the street have no clue that there is such a thing as a GLCC or that there is Shepherd's Heart until they're on the street for a little bit of time and they bump into somebody. Another person said that below, that we've got a ton of resources, but they're haphazard. So that's the perception, at least from some of the young people. Doesn't mean they're not very grateful. I have to say that. They mentioned by name so many of you with great affection and appreciation for when you dig in your pockets and you give them the money for the bus pass, or you buy the shoes, which because your agency doesn't have the money to buy the shoes, you are doing that. So it was very moving to realize how much they also appreciated what people do. So I did take a look at national models, including San Francisco, and I'd say that the 4 characteristics that they all possess also match up with what the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness recommends in our homeless programs, and that is that we first really work on making kids safe and getting them into stable housing, that we think about their permanent connections because their relationships matter enormously for their stability, that we also make sure we focus on their education and employment, and that we're always mindful of their social and emotional well-being and doing what we can to reduce their trauma. So I'm just going to show a couple of pictures here for what would really be very great if we could do something like this here. But Larkin Street in San Francisco, which has 5,700 homeless young adults and serves 2/3 of them every year, has set up a really nice continuum that starts with a dynamic outreach effort, a fleet of vans that go out and find kids and that have many of the resources that we want them to have for their hygiene and for them to be able to survive and to have socks, but that also says to them, let me take you to a place where it's warm and safe. And then they can take them to any of a set of drop-in centers that have a lot of the things that our youth asked for in their drop-in center here. And then from there, the youth can get into more permanent housing. And some of this housing is subdivided by the particular types of needs of the young people. For example, for youth coming out of foster care, there's a special group home with wraparound support for them. And then after they're finished with that, they get promoted and get ready to go into their own individual apartments where there's some rent assistance provided to them. Similarly, they have similar programs for kids who have serious mental illnesses. For kids who are LGBT, they have all kinds of varieties of group housing for them. They have a school, a vocational program. They co-locate their employment services program with their drop-in centers. It's really a beautiful continuum that understands that these are highly vulnerable kids and they don't expect them to figure it all out. One other thing to mention is that they also make family reunification a goal whenever that's possible. And thinking back to the typology, if there is a possibility that young people can go home, they can't find their parents, they need resources to get back home, and it really does make sense. That seems to be something very important to weave into what we do here as well. There's some more pictures of Market Street. So I found 3 issues, and I make some recommendations in this report. The first is the one that I described where you saw the little map, that we have a lot of services, but they really are dispersed and they're decentralized. And what I mean by that is that it's not like we say there are 12 drop-in centers, all of which have 5 core services. That's not the case. It's really that you go here at 9 o'clock, if you want this service, you go there and you have to know to go there at noon, and they're all over the place. So it's a system that truly depends on kids knowing something and having great shoe leather, because that's what they do, is they wear out their shoes walking around to get services. This is something that a young man said. He was delighted he got a job, and look how he's trying to swing a bus ticket. Like, he's going to go to VLP, he's going to go to Operation Safety Net, he's going to go see Miss Nancy. As you can infer, it's a system we built for adults, and yet there are parts of the system that when some adults come and they look younger, they're not as welcoming. This is what one of the providers said, and I think he was very honest and probably very wise, saying, I feel uncomfortable, I don't know that these older guys who are here are a good influence on the younger people. And when I called one shelter, a woman told me, you know, those young kids come here and they sexualize the whole environment. I don't want them here. So we built this for adults, but we haven't really thought it through from the sort of the lens of what's really going to work for people who are in this period of their lives. And there are gaps. I didn't detect in my conversations with most people that family reunification is folded into or even a consideration in what we do. And I mentioned that we are undersupplied on emergency shelter beds. There should never be a time that if a young person wants to come in out of the cold, they can't find a place to sleep. But that is the case here on some winter nights. There are lack of shelter options for LGBTQ young adults. That's partially due to the fact they don't feel welcome in the whole system to start with, so that already cuts back on the places that they can go. And it's also true that we haven't really thought through the continuum from their perspective either, of what it's like to be LGBTQ, show up in a shelter where you have to take a congregate shower, where no one thinks about where you're sleeping and how unsafe you might feel, or where you're made fun of by other people, including staff. And I mentioned earlier that I think that the emphasis on work and having the options or have the resources to be able to help young people find jobs would be very, very important here. And here's a quote from a young person when I said, well, tell me about how you find out. Oh, we're our own outreach. We tell each other. Now, they wanted also to make sure I knew that they're not one cohesive group of kids walking around who all know each other. It's not the case. As I mentioned at the outset, they want to be invisible for the most part, but they do have networks of kids that whom they develop trust. And they say, for example, you want to go to GLCC, that's a place of good peace. And here are my recommendations, which really flow from kind of all of this, and from a lot of suggestions that providers and the young people made themselves. One is, wherever possible, if we can expand the window of services, bump it up from 21 to 24, that in itself would make the 23, 24-year-olds, 22-year-olds have options that they don't right now. Mm-hmm. There is a shelter that serves 18 to 21-year-olds that actually at some points is a little bit under capacity. If we could increase that window, that would be a great thing for some of the older youth. And that's legally allowed under the HUD definition. And thinking about sort of the planning services for this age range would be critical along the continuum. And I don't know that we've actually done that in quite a long while. And wouldn't it be great to be able to sit down, think about their development, what we have, what we want to build, and all those different resources and how that could come together into some kind of a cohesive plan that we work toward. We also want to be able to increase shelter options for youth, including increasing LGBTQ competence. Now, if we were able to train and change some minds within some shelters, it might be that overnight there would be more options for those young people. But the fact is we still do need more shelter, period. And across the continuum, we really want to make sure that we keep an eye on quality. There were a couple young people who said, does anybody do secret shoppers like in any of these places? Can't you do that? Can't one of us go undercover? Because there are things that are going on you need to know about. We should know. We should really have a system, a way of checking in to be sure that kids are being treated with dignity, they're getting the services that we think they deserve, we know they deserve, and that they're really, truly being helped. I just wanted to end with this quote here, which is the title of the report. And let me tell you about how this sort of issued from someone's mouth. This young man had been on the street for over a year and was exhausted. You could see he was exhausted. And we had a focus group, and there were some people there who had actually come back because they made it out of homelessness and they wanted to really help, and they were very energized about that. And one of those successes said to the others in the group, you know, you've got to really watch because you can get used to being homeless, and you should have seen the looks on the young people's faces. And this young man said, I will never get used to it. It's in my heart to get off the streets. And that was really, to me, very passionate, very telling way of saying, let's help them as soon as we can help them. Let's do all the work that we're doing together, and let's make sure we really, really build a system that works for them. Thank you.
In mind, the idea of multicultural ethnic background. A lot of what we're doing, I mean, the centers are not prepared for a foreign-born individual who may even have the simplest problem of communicating. So I would ask, as all the plans start moving forward, that we as a collective movement keep in mind those ideas, because we will, as a community, as it's becoming more of a hot topic of being welcoming and immigration and refugee resettlement, we're going to need to be able to be prepared when we send folks or folks come in that just may even just can't even speak the language and yet have all the trauma that they have. So that would be my first request of this whole group, to not forget that group.
Any of our speakers want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's actually, gracias, muy importante. Look, the reality is that the research supports that. In fact, we're talking about family reunification. A research study done in the state of New Mexico found that the best population to reunify with their families are Latinos. And in fact, in a study that was done, it showed that they had 5 times more likelihood of reunifying with their families than other similarly age-matched populations. So the research substantiates that. And the reality is that there's no one cultural approach to this, that it has to be a multicultural approach. You can't just assume that people of color are those that are experiencing homelessness, because everyone's experiencing homelessness. Very good point.